Welcome back to Books on Books on Books, with me, your host, Caroline Culpepper. This week we have with us Ben Brown.
Hi.
Andy Bernetti.
Hey.
And Anna Bello.
Hello.
We are going to be talking about Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried. Specifically, we will be discussing the character development in the first introductory chapter, self-named The Things They Carried. I think it's very important to note that this is one of the few chapters in the book that Tim chooses to write from a third-person omniscient point of view. So we will be taking that into account throughout the entire episode.
Right, so this is what allows us to really see into how each of the characters truly feels about their situation and to fully understand the nature of each character's burdens due to the fact that Tim's able to recount everything that goes on from this perspective. O'Brien demonstrates who the characters were based on what they carried.
I think it's important to start with one of the major characters, the leader of their company, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross.
I agree. He is literally in the first sentence of the entire book, and not only is he introduced in this sentence, but we are first given an insight into who he is as a character.
But before we analyze deeper who he is as a character, let's take a look at what the author, Tim O'Brien, tells us that all the soldiers were required to carry as standard equipment.
Well, from this introductory chapter, I've compiled a list of what O'Brien says they all carried, being professional soldiers. At first mention of their equipment, the book says that what they carried was largely determined by necessity. Their equipment is precisely what one might expect from a group of soldiers, from pocket knives to matches to cigarettes. From their basic equipment, the book says that they started off carrying 12 to 18 pounds, depending on a man's habits.
Right, and after this the book starts to get specific with what each character carries based on who they are. This section confronts such things as the abstract emotional attachment and mental preoccupation that are harbored by each character Mr. O'Brien describes to us. We will take a further look into that later in the episode.
O'Brien doesn't delve too deeply into what these basic essentials mean to each character, as they honestly don't seem to mean anything. What is really interesting is when he lists some piece of equipment that would seem standard to anyone else, but he sets apart for some reason or another.
A good example of this is when O'Brien is describing more of the standard equipment, and when he explains that, with its quilted liner, the poncho weighed almost 2 pounds, but is worth every ounce. The following sentence then explains that when Ted Lavender was shot, they used the poncho to carry his body to the chopper that took him away.
Not only is this a great example of foreshadowing into the character of Ted Lavender and what danger might befall him, but it shows the method for which O'Brien describes the things they carried. He describes each piece of equipment as the soldiers remembered them. For the basic equipment, they didn't mean too much to each of the soldiers, as they were, after all, just the basics. However, if the soldiers used something during an emotional time, they would be more likely to remember it and thusly associate that event with the object, as in the case of the poncho.
This is something that remains true throughout the entire first chapter and allows the reader to see what meant the most to soldiers, something that is very useful in revealing their character. So on the 5th page, we're introduced to what concrete things Lieutenant Cross carried, and due to his rank and mission, he had compass, maps, a pistol weighing 2.9 pounds, code books, and other necessities. In addition, he carried letters from his back-home lover, Martha.
Okay, here we go. I think Martha is a good segue into the emotional burdens that Jimmy Cross carried.
Besides the responsibility for the lives of his men, Cross certainly carried an emotional attachment to a young Jersey girl named Martha. Overall, he continues to keep these letters that he tantalizingly signs with love, just hoping that someday she might love him back. However, this love will surely distract him in the end and keep him from leading himself and his soldiers not only effectively but safely. In summation, the letters Jimmy Cross carried doubled as burdens, both physical and emotional.
As for the physical side of the letters, the repetition of the phrase separate but together shows the contradictions in their relationship and really emphasizes the ambiguity of their relationship. We can tell the extent of his unrequited love for her through the quote, slowly, a bit distracted, he would get up and move among his men, checking the perimeter. Then at dark, he would return to his hole and watch the night and wonder if Martha was a virgin. This reveals his true attachment to her, and that his real job as Alpha Company leader becomes a mere distraction from his emotional attachment to Martha, and the burden it becomes later. This stands as an instance in support of the idea that the emotional part of the letters carried by Cross is much more of a burden than that of a physical burden.
Other ways that this burden is revealed to the reader is through the tangible things he carried. One such object is the pebble that he carries that metaphorically represents his separation from Martha and the confusion in their relationship. The letters represent the miscommunication between them as well. And if we go back to where it mentions that Martha signs all the letters with love, she may view this as a way to close a letter, but he would actually like it to mean love. His misinterpretations from the things he has for Martha later come back to haunt him.
Alright, we will be right back after this short break to move on to the next members of Alpha Company, now that we know the man behind their leadership.
Welcome back to the show, where we are now moving into the next character.
As he doesn't last for very long in the book, I think that we should move on to Ted Lavender next.
Sounds good to me. I mean, even if he wasn't alive for very long within the chronology of the book, I felt like we had a good feel for who he was and his effect on the other members of Alpha Company.
When Lavender is first introduced to us, O'Brien begins by telling the reader that he was scared. It is something that is very important to take note of because it is repeated throughout the chapter, that Ted Lavender was a scared man.
What I personally thought was interesting and honestly a little insulting was that in the very same sentence that you are referencing, it says that he carried tranquilizers until he was shot in the head outside of the village of Tankey in mid-April.
You know, I'm intrigued as to why you thought that was insulting, because I saw it as more of an essential detail to who he was and how the other soldiers remember him by. As a person, arguably the most significant role that Ted played in their lives was dying, and consequently placing the burden of his own death on the shoulders of his companions.
Okay, I can see where you're coming from with that. I guess it just takes a more analytical reader to take that from the text, as opposed to just seeing it as a shallow sentence.
Aside from being dead, though, O'Brien does disclose more about who he is by what he carried. For example, it is repeated over and over that he carried both tranquilizers and 6 to 7 pounds of premium dope, which for him was a necessity, because of his anxiety and fear.
Right, I mean, O'Brien really makes an attempt of showing just how much his fear weighed on him, even more than his equipment most of the time. Like when he says all the things he carried, plus the flak jacket and helmet and rations and water and toilet paper and tranquilizers and all the rest, plus the unweighed fear.
Even with all of his downfalls, O'Brien still manages to show us that there was a person beneath the facade of a soldier. He tells us that Ted carried the Starlight scope before he died, an aspect that isn't really important to the plot of the story, but allows the reader to understand that he was a person too, that even just like stargazing or had an interest in astronomy. Okay, well, it's time for another break before we move on to the next character, so we'll be right back. Welcome back to our show, where we are now going to move on to the next two characters that O'Brien deeply develops in the first chapter, Kiowa and Henry Dobbins. Using the same analytical lens as was used earlier for the other characters, we can quickly begin to see who they are.
First, we have Kiowa, a real contrast to the previous characters in his morals and who he was. It's important to note that he carried an illustrated version of the New Testament that was given to him by his father, who was a Sunday school teacher.
Right. From this we can tell that Kiowa was a man of devout religion, a Baptist at heart, and this alone sets him apart from the other characters. He is an honest man and is able to provide a different perspective to the actions of other members of Alpha Company.
I mean, all this we can tell just from one simple item that he's carrying. In the same way, we can further understand who Henry Dobbins will be in the book just from this introductory chapter.
Henry Dobbins was the pre-designated machine gunner of the company due to his heavier build. Aside from the shallow analysis of his character, however, he was an entirely different person on the inside.
Right. Behind that machine gun wielding beast of a man was a person who wore his girlfriend's pantyhose around his neck at all times. This simple article of clothing allows us to know who he was on the inside. He kept this reminder of home around as a comforter to constantly remind him just who he was fighting for and give him a reason to live until he could go home.
As such, we can know that he was a compassionate man, a man that finds safety in his relationships with other people and who is fighting so he can return safely home.
Okay, well, I think that's all we have time for on this segment. So after the break, we will come back and have listener questions for our special guest, Tim O'Brien himself. Alright, so now it's time for everyone's favorite segment of the show. It's question time. We have a very special treat today because we have the actual author of the book, Mr. Tim O'Brien.
It's O'Brien, but thanks, I'm excited to be here.
Okay. We have had some very eager listeners send in questions for you. Our first is from Timmy Chris in San Diego, California. Let's give a listen.
Hi, Mr. O'Brien. As far as the objects mentioned in the opening chapter, What purpose did the extremely specific accounts of the weights of the objects, such as in the quote, "The weapon weighed 7.5 pounds unloaded, 8.2 pounds with its full 20-round magazine"?
Well, that's because the story itself isn't 100% true.
Wait, this didn't actually all happen?
No, but I wanted the story to come as close to reality as possible, so in order to do so, precise details were necessary. Also, the numbers help to exaggerate the amount of physical weight and burdens that the members of Alpha Company may or may not have carried.
Great question. Our next question is from Jenny Manziel from Cleveland, Ohio.
Why do the soldiers tell jokes about the war and about killing? That seems kind of morbid.
Right, well, I choose to mention that so they found jokes to tell to first describe the ways in which they managed to have fun and enjoy themselves, but mainly used to portray the way the war in Vietnam take away morals and decivilize people. It really goes to show what war can make people corrupt and completely distort their perception.
All right, well, that's sadly all the time we have for today's episode. I'd like to thank today's wonderful co-hosts, Tim O'Brien, and of course all the listeners. Join us next week for our discussion of Grapes of Wrath.